Now that we have our player object, we're going to actually use other controls to control it. We want to have the option to use WA and D and the gamepad. Construct 2 makes this very easy for us to do, so what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our event sheet here, and it's a good thing we grouped our other code here so we can minimize this. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up WA and D. So I'm going to add an event here for the keyboard, and on key is down. I'm going to hit the D key, and I'm going to copy and paste this twice. Double click on this condition, switch that to A, and now for this one, I'm going to double click on this. I'm going to go back. I'm going to change it to on key press because this is a jump. We're not holding it down. And I'm actually move this up so we have something like that, WA and D. We're obviously not going to duck, so we don't need the S in there, but you would just do the same exact thing. And what we're going to do now is when we press the key, we're going to go into the mask and we're going to simulate control. So for W, we're going to jump, and I'm going to control and click this action down. For A, we're going to go left. That was right. Click on left. And I'm going to control click this down again and go to the right. So now if I hit save and if I hit play, W, A, and D should now be controls that I can use in addition to the arrow keys. Now again, entirely up to you what controls you want to support. I think this is pretty common today in platformers to either pick between W, A, S, and D and the arrow keys altogether. And then the gamepad is generally a staple that you kind of should always have, I think at least. So I'm going to group these together, and I'll call this WASD just in case I want to do a duck in the future. And I'm going to tuck these in there. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this again for the gamepad. So one thing I could probably do here is I could copy and paste this. And I could edit the group and call this gamepad. And from here, I can just cut out these events because they're going to have the exact same actions. So the events for the gamepad are interesting. And if you use the retro style project as you followed along, the gamepad object will already be in here versus having to add it in over here. So the gamepad object is actually very simple to use. So for jump, I'm going to double click on this event here, go gamepad, and we're going to go for a button press. We're not going to hold it down. On button pressed on the A key, this gamepad 0 means it's the first gamepad that is plugged in, which is the only one that's plugged in. If you had another gamepad plugged in, it would be gamepad 1, so it starts with the index of 0. And then I can just kind of do the same thing. I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to go gamepad. Now this is kind of where it gets a little bit trickier, I guess. It's just not as simple as pressing a button. In this case, we have to compare the analog axis. So let's do that. For moving to the left, we're going to compare this axis. We're going to compare the x-axis on gamepad 0. So actually, we don't have to change anything so far. We're going to find out if it is less than 0. And I'm going to copy and paste this. And as you probably have already guessed, we're going to find out if it's greater than 0. And that is pretty simple, actually, when you think about it. Let's hit save. Not too hard to set up. Let me get my gamepad. And let me hit A on the keyboard and move with the left and right on the left analog. But we're going to run into an issue here, and that is if I push up on the analog, the left analog, or if I push down, I'm actually still moving. So this is kind of an issue here. And what we really need to do is we need to limit the left analog's movement. So it's actually not as complicated as you might think. Let's go back into our event sheet here. So what we need to do here is we need to actually limit the left analog from moving up and down. And you'll notice here that for the left analog, we need to limit it from moving down or from being controlled when you push the left analog down. And to do this, instead of comparing the x-axis, we need to compare the y-axis. So let's copy and paste this condition, and let's double click and let's open this up here. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to compare the left analog y-axis, and we're going to find out if it's greater than the current gamepad axis. Now to get this, we could either start typing it out, which you've seen me do in the past, or we can actually use this objects with expressions window, which is kind of invisible, not necessarily easy to see if you don't know it's there, but we actually have like the full documentation of Construct 2 at our fingertips ready for us to use. So watch here as I go to gamepad, It's actually the very first one that I want. And what I'm going to get here is I'm going to return the axis input from -100 to 100. It's for what we can compare for the y-axis. So I'm going to double click on this, and it's actually going to input the code for me. All I have to do is change these parameters, and I'm going to put in 0, and I'm going to put in 0. Close that off, just like that. And I'm going to hit done. So don't be too afraid if you don't understand this. Just go at it one at a time and test it out, and you'll see the changes take place. Then what I want to do here is I just want to make sure I get all of the y-axis. So I'm going to copy and paste this condition. And I'm actually going to flip this. I'm going to find out if it's less than negative gamepad axis for our gamepad equal to 0. So let's hit play here. And let me get my gamepad. And now when I move left and right, if I push up, I can still, we haven't fixed that yet. So up is still going to the right. But if I push down on the left analog, I know you can hear it, but you can't see it. Nothing's actually happening. So if you test that out for yourself, you'll notice that now we've limited the y-axis on the down movement for our gamepad, which is pretty great. Now that we've actually limited it to the left, let's limit it to the right. And to do this, all we have to do is copy these two conditions and paste them in. And from there, we just have to flip them. So let's double click over here. And instead of comparing it from greater than, let's compare it to less than. And instead of comparing it from less than, let's compare it to greater than. Just like that. Let's hit save. And let's test this out. Grab my gamepad again. And now, when I move up on the left analog, absolutely nothing is happening. So now, our left analog y-axis is effectively not working. And we can just move left and right with it. So that's going to be extremely helpful for making any type of game. If you wanted to do the same thing for the right analog, you could. And now we have arrow key movement, we've got WAD movement, and now we have our gamepad, which is just going to give our players every option under the sun. Thank you so much for watching this lecture. I really hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next one. In this lecture, we're going to add in our player animations. So if you see here on our player layer, I've already added in a sprite with my player sprite sheet. To add in the sprite, I just double clicked, went to new sprite, and then I loaded in the sprite sheet image right over here. You can download this sprite sheet below. And another way that you might end up doing this in the future is you might actually be going into the animation frames, importing from sprite strip instead. I'm choosing to do it this way. Because I think this way is a little bit more casual, and I end up doing it this way more often than not. And you might think that this might be the wrong way. There's really no right way to do this as long as your animation frames are there. So here we have our falling animation. It's just a frame. We have a jump frame, and then we have our idle animation and our walk animation. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cut out these and leave our falling frame right there. And I'm going to rename from default. I'm going to rename it, and if it doesn't pop up like that, you can just click on it anyway. Construct 2 is a little slow sometimes. And I'm going to call that ID fall. Make another animation here. I'm going to call this ID jump. And the ID prefix is going to come really in handy in a second here. I'm going to paste this in, and now I'm going to cut the rest out. I'm going to go add animation, ID idle. And I'm going to cut out the walk cycle. Add another animation for the walk cycle. And there we go. So now I've cut everything out from the sprite strip and put them in their own animations, but they all have this ridiculous amount of white space. So to fix this, I'm going to go over here to the crop tool. These are probably the two most useful tools in the image editor here, and they're probably next to these two. They're the most useful ones that I use the most often. So the crop tool, when you highlight over it, it says you can hold shift. And when you do that, it actually will do that for every single frame in the animation. And even though there was only one frame here, get into the habit of holding down shift. So here we have one frame as well. There we go. Now if we split this up into multiple frames, so now I'm in the ID idle, let's do that first and then I can show you the shift. So I'm going to cut out this, and just like we did before, except over here in the animation frames window, I'm going to add a frame. And I'm going to start doing process of elimination until I'm down to one sprite. And I'm just going to keep doing that. Now, obviously, this may not be the fastest way you could do that. Like I said before, you could import from a sprite strip. but I end up doing it this way just to give it a little bit more control. Okay, so now on my ID idle, I have 6 frames here of the idle animation. It's all over the place at the moment. I'm going to go to frame 0, and I'm going to hold down Shift on the crop tool. And you'll see that it's going to crop every single frame in the animation. And we'll come back to that in a second. Let's do the same exact thing here for our walk cycle. I'm going to add the frame. And if you want to pause this and go ahead and do this on your own and then come back, by all means. But we're almost done here. And one more frame. And then we're going to do the crop. One thing that actually does happen here is I went too fast. I didn't let it sit, so I have to make sure I deselect when I do it that way. I guess that might be a con of doing it that way. But I don't know. I find myself doing it that way more often than not. Okay, so now we have our animations. We have our ID fall, our ID jump, our ID idle, and our ID walk. And again, we'll get into the prefix in a second. Now we have to set up our animation. So here's how I like to do this. I like to set it up where everything is on the bottom part of the canvas here, except for frames where you're jumping. So for things that you need to have your foot on the ground, I like to make sure that it's on the ground. Now I've seen construct work before where you have it like this and it works, but for my own sanity, I like to just make sure that I have complete control over sprites that touch the floor here. So our mask is what's really touching the floor, and we need to make sure that this appeals to the mask. So let's do that again for ID idle. And what I mean by that is we need to make sure that this is in line with our mask. So we're going to have to set the origin point here in a second. As soon as I'm done setting everything. For our jump and fall frame, we can leave them in the air. For things that are actually in the air, we can leave them in the air. For things that are supposed to be on the ground, I'm putting them on the ground. Okay, so now the other 2 important things here, and these are actually probably the most important things, are the origin and image points. Origin and image points and collision box. So let's actually take a look at the collision box first here. Now it seems like we're in pretty good shape for the idle, but not for the fall. For the jump, we're in good shape, and it looks like we're in good shape for most of these except for the fall here. So this kind of happens with Construct 2 a lot. And what I want to do to fix this, I'm going to right-click with this tool, the collision points tool. I'm going to set it to a bounding box. I'm going to right-click again and apply it to every single animation. I'm going to hit yes, and now I know that every animation has a bounding box, just like our mask. This is just important, just in case you needed the collision. Really, this will still collide with things. If it messes up, that might be one of the reasons why. I'm trying to think, since the way we set it up, we're trying to avoid having this animation collide with anything. We're letting the mask do all the collision. You just want to make sure that you still have this set. That's definitely a big mistake that I see happen often. So now the other thing that happens often, and this one's actually very important for the animation for this, we need to assign the origin point. Now the origin point's nowhere to be found here. So let's go quick assign, go to the bottom, and there it is. And let's do the same thing. Right click, apply to all animations. That way we know our origin's always going to be at the bottom. So its feet will be lined up with the bottom of the mask. Cool, so those are our animations. Let's exit out of this, and let's call this our O wizard, or you can call it O player. We'll call it O player, might as well, even though he's going to be a wizard. And let's do one thing here. Let's add an instance variable to our player. This, if you don't know what an instance variable is, it's kind of like, this own object has this own instance variable, and for each version of this object, if we were to copy and paste it, they all have separate values. So it's pretty handy. The value or the name of the instance variable we're going to give this is going to be animator, and we're going to give it a type of text. Now this is going to store our prefix, so when we come into our event sheet now, we can actually control our animations. So let's put our player over here. You can see that this is starting to shape up. I can kind of do that. Oh, and one other thing that I want to do really quickly, let me turn off snap to grid, and let me kind of resize this manually. We actually have to do 2 things. First, I'm going to resize this to be the edges of our player, so it kind of turns out to be roughly 8 by 12 for this, for our mask. And the other thing is the animations start in the order of which they're presented. So right now ID fall is there, and I want it to be ID idle. that's generally the one that I want to be the default animation. So I just dragged that to the top. Cool. So now that we have that, we can deal with our animator and our ID prefix. Let's go into our event sheet here, and let's organize our code a bit more. Let's minimize our controls here, but let's actually right-click and add a group and call this player controls. Okay, let's put our gamepad group in there and our WASD group as well. Let's take our player controls and let's hit B on the keyboard and let's start setting up our animations. So the first thing we have to do here is with our new event, I'm going to double click on it and we're going to go into our mask, which is what our player actually is. It's where our player is actually moving. And I'm going to actually check to see if our platform behavior is moving. So I'm going to double click on that. And I'm going to copy and paste this 2 more times, or 3 more times here. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually invert this condition. So I'm going to select this, I'm going to hit I on the keyboard, or you could probably right click and hit invert. And now this is going to say if the mask is not moving. And then for these two, I'm going to double click on this. I'm going to say if it's jumping or if it's falling, just like our animations. And we set our animator value in our player animation. So let's go do that. Let's add the action, oPlayer, set the value of the animator to the corresponding animation action or event. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to set this one to walk, like that, with the 2 quotes. Copy and paste. We're going to set this one to idle. Copy and paste. We're going to set this one to jump. And we can control click this one instead of copying and pasting. And we're going to set this one to fall, just like that. So now our player should actually animate, but we have no way of having our mask and our player be in the same spot. So to fix this, let's go into our every tick, which again runs every frame of the game, and let's set the player's position here. Now we have 2 options. We could either set position to another object and you can pick the mask, which is totally fine, or you can get more control over that by just saying omask.x, omask.y. This is the way I like to do it, just in case I want more control over it for any reason when it comes to enhancing the player's movements. To tie this all together, now that we have a way to actually track the player animations and the mask with this, we need a way to actually set the animations, because right now all we're doing is setting the instance variable of animator to walk, idle, jump, and fall when the mask is moving, but the animation itself is not being set. And to do this, and to make this really effective, we're going to go into our every tick, which runs every frame of the game, and we're going to go into our player, and we're going to set the animation to ID underscore and whatever our animator equals. So we're going to use the self to grab the player, because that's the player, that's the object we're in. So it's saying oPlayer is what it's really saying, but we're going to use self. And we're grabbing whatever this instance variable equals. And by having this prefix and by having this underscore there, it's effectively adding it onto what we're setting it. So right here, if the platform is moving, set the animator to walk. So now this is going to be like saying that, except that exists here. Same thing for idle, jump, and fall. So just by doing it this way, we can add any amount of animations that we want, and then we just have to trigger them and set the instance variable to that animation. So this is a really great way of doing that, and it takes up a lot less code. So let's hit play here and let's test this out finally, and let's see it work, which is really cool. So we see that it's tracking our mask and it's setting the animations. Now we have a few things that we have to change here, but even our jump and our fall are working as well. So the first thing I want to change here is the speed of the animation. Let's double click over here. Now that's going to entirely depend on what artwork you're using. But for this artwork, I'm going to double the speed for the idle. Double the frames, I mean. Well, actually there's 6 frames. So I think I liked it at 10. I'm going to put the walk actually to 12. So we're going to double that. And then these can stay as they are. We don't have to, the jump and the fall can stay since there's just 1 frame, there's no speed on them. Okay, so let's see if that fixes it. And that's just going to be up to you and your preference of how you want it to run. See, I think that idle animation looks better there, and I think this walk cycle looks a little bit better faster. Now the final thing that we have to fix here is when I hit the left key, the player's still moving to the right, even though it's moving left, or it's still facing the right way. or to the right. So to fix this, I'm going to group this together. I'll call this player animations. Put all of this in here. And I'm actually going to do this with, let's see, I'm going to hit B on the player controls group here. I'm going to say, double click over here on the blank sub event, go keyboard. I want to say right arrow is down. That's going to be my first one. And I'm going to make this into an OR block. So I'm going to copy and paste this and hit Y. I'm going to say OR if the D key is down. And I'm going to copy and paste all of this. I'm going to do the same for the inverse here, which would be left arrow and the A key, like so. And quite simply, we're just going to mirror the OPlayer object. So if the left arrow is down here, we're going to set it to mirrored. And I'm going to control click this. And if the right arrow is down, we're going to say not mirrored. Now, the only thing we have to do here, and this is something we can fix later on, is we need to set this for our gamepad as well. And just to make this easier on ourselves, I'm going to have this copy and paste right over here rather than doing that. So generally the rule of thumb is you don't want to have to reuse the actions you've already used. So what we could do in the future is we can make this a function call like we've done with our aspect ratio, and we could call the mirror function, and that will automatically do that. So here we could just call the mirror function, call the not mirrored, call the mirrored, and so on and so forth, rather than having them all broken up into pieces. And let me just group this together and call this player mirrored. For now, this will do. And for prototyping this is what does the trick. You know, you just want to get it to work. So let's hit Control Save, and let's hit play. And now all controls should be able to mirror our character. That was the arrow keys. This is W, A, and D. And my gamepad's somewhere, but I'm pretty sure it's going to work. So that is how we add in our player animations. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next lecture. This is going to be a quick lecture and serve as a reminder, even though we've gone over all of these things already, just a few mistakes that people make or tend to make a lot or forget about. So then I get kind of flooded with questions and emails saying, why isn't this working? Why isn't this working? The first couple mistakes that I've seen is the pixel rounding is not turned off. Make sure that's turned off. I wouldn't say that this one's a mistake, but it's always good to turn that on as high quality in case that you go full screen and then all of a sudden it's not, you know, pixel perfect. You can't really see it anymore. But really, the bigger issues happen with the animations and with the collisions. And I know I've already stressed this enough already, but I want to stress it again because it really is the most common thing that happens to people here, is that this origin point, even if it's only one origin point, let's say that's at the top and the rest are at the bottom, that is forever going to mess this up. So when I go and hit play here, it's really, look at that. That's going to happen. Or if you had pixel rounding on and you tried to collide, something similar to that might happen. So really making sure that everything is the same and is where you want it to be is probably going to be your biggest challenge at first until you get used to it. Another thing is sometimes people do put the frame up like this. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure if that actually has any effect on it, but I've always thought that it does. So I say just play it on the safe side, and anything that's in the air, anything that's jumping or falling, that's okay to have like a pixel worth of padding here, or maybe some more padding. But things that should be on the ground should be at the very bottom of the canvas here. And then finally, just make sure that everything is a shape for your collision. Even if this animation itself isn't colliding, make sure that everything has the right shaped collision. Otherwise, you're going to get messed up. Now, if your collision is, maybe it's a tile, and this might happen later on, maybe it's a slanted tile like this, you have to make sure that the next tile finishes off here. So this was at, let's see, let's go down in integer here. So that's at 3. Now, if the next tile was over, that tile collision has to pick up at 3 and then go back up. So things like slopes and stuff like that, I see that happening a whole lot. So just a really quick reminder here to double check your origin points, your collision polygons, and your animation frames, making sure that they're all in the right spot. Make sure that your project properties are set the way that you want them, the way that you want the game to play. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one.